200 people clapped for my wife the night she took 68% of everything I owned because she used the word protected and smiled when she said it. I was the only person in that ballroom who understood, sitting there with a heart barely 6 months healed, that the applause was for a lie dressed up as generosity. I put my fork down. I did not pick it back up. And 3 months later, every single person in that room, including the two who orchestrated it, would learn exactly how wrong they'd been about who they were dealing with. But that comes later. Let me back up, because the story doesn't really start with a fork hitting the linen. It starts 2 hours earlier in a ballroom I built with my own 2 hands, on a night I still believed was simply a party. The Tremont Grand's ballroom still smelled faintly of the cedar I had used to reframe its ceiling 11 years earlier, underneath all that Grey Goose and gardenia. I had restored that ceiling beam by beam after the roof gave out in a storm nobody in Galveston likes to name out loud anymore. Vivian picked the venue herself. She said it would mean something, celebrating 30 years inside a room I had saved with my own hands. I should have heard the word saved the way she meant it. Past tense, something that used to be mine. 200 guests filled the round tables, candlelight catching the crystal, my old crew scattered among bankers and county commissioners who had never once picked up a trowel in their lives. Roz sat 2 tables back, watching me the way she always did at these things, like she was waiting for the roof to give out again. My cardiologist had cleared me for exactly this kind of evening 4 weeks earlier, with the same tired warning he gave every visit. Keep your stress down, Mr. Sorensen. Your heart has already told you what it can and cannot carry. I lifted my glass when the MC called for it, and I meant every word I said about Vivian. 30 years is not nothing. I still believed that, even standing at the edge of what I did not yet know was a cliff. She squeezed my hand under the table, and for one foolish, grateful second I let myself believe the squeeze meant what it used to mean. Then she stood. She tapped her spoon against her glass the way she did at every dinner party. 3 light taps, practiced smooth. The room quieted the way rooms do for a woman who has never once doubted they would. She thanked everyone for coming. She thanked the Whitfield family. And I noticed she said the whole family, not just Desmond. And I filed that away without knowing yet why it mattered. Then she said that after everything Emmett and I have built, we wanted to make sure it's protected the right way, for the right people, for the long haul. She said the words estate planning like they belonged in a toast. She said that as of this morning, 68% of the controlling interest in Cornerstone Realty Group now sat under her name for tax purposes, for the future, for peace of mind. The room clapped. 200 people who had eaten my barbecue and slept under roofs my company built clapped because a smiling woman in a blue dress had used the word protected, and protected sounds like something you applaud. I watched Desmond Whitfield clap beside her, half a beak behind everyone else, his eyes cutting toward me for exactly 1 second before they found somewhere safer to land. I had seen that look before on subcontractors, right before they told me a foundation had failed inspection. It is the look of a man checking whether you already know. I did not know. Not the shape of it, not yet. My chest did something I recognized from the hospital bed 6 months earlier. A tightening that had nothing to do with my heart, and everything to do with the sudden understanding that the floor I was standing on had already been sold out from under me. Quietly, while I was busy learning how to breathe again. Vivian looked at me across that ballroom I had rebuilt with my own hands, smiling the smile she used for photographs, and asked if I wanted to say a few words. I set my fork down on the linen the way I already told you I would. This time I want you to see exactly why. A few weeks before that ballroom, before the toast, before any of it, I still believed the ground I was standing on was the safest place I had. That ground, that particular week, happened to be the second-floor joists of a Queen Anne on Sealy Avenue, a house built in 1892 and nearly lost twice since, once to fire and once to neglect. I had my trowel in my hand, the same one I bought at 19 years old, with money I'd saved from carrying brick, and I was troweling fresh mortar into a chimney seam my crew had opened up that morning. There is a rhythm to that work that I have never found anywhere else. Load spread strikes smooth. It empties a man out in the good way, the kind of empty that leaves room for thinking about something other than himself. I had built a company on that rhythm. 40 employees, now contracts with 3 counties, and I still came out to the sites myself whenever I could. Because a desk has never once taught me anything a wall couldn't. That morning, what filled the empty space was my father, the way he sometimes does when my hands are busy and my guard is down. I could see him plain as anything, the particular set of his shoulders when he carried a hod up a ladder, the way he hummed hymns under his breath without ever seeming to notice he was doing it. My father laid brick for 40 years in 3 counties, and in his final job before his back gave out, a contractor named Weller stiffed him 9 weeks of pay and denied it ever happened because my father had never once asked for anything in writing. A handshake had always been enough for him. It had never once failed him before, not until the one time it mattered most. I remember standing in the yard of the house we rented, 7 years old, watching him argue with a man in a clean shirt who kept saying the word prove like it was a hammer he enjoyed swinging. My father had no paper. He had 30 years of calluses and a memory nobody in that yard was willing to trust over a typed page. We lost the house that winter. I built my whole life on the opposite of that yard. Everything Cornerstone Realty Group ever signed, I signed twice, read 3 times, filed in triplicate, kept copies in a safe deposit box. I visited more often than some men visit church. I told myself that was diligence. I understand now it was fear wearing a hard hat, a boy in the yard who never stopped trying to out-document his father's ghost. I finished the seam that morning, stepped back to check the line against the string, and felt something pulled tight across my chest, low and strange like a strap cinched 1 notch too far. I told it to wait. I had 2 more feet of mortar and a crew watching to see if the boss still had it in him at 63. That is the kind of foolishness that runs in men like me, the belief that pain is something you can simply outwork if you keep your hands moving. I have built entire houses on that belief. It has never once served me as poorly as it did that morning. The strap pulled tighter. My left arm went heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the trowel still hanging from my fingers. Somewhere behind me, I heard Danny, my foreman, say my name twice before I understood he was talking to me and not to someone else standing in the room of my own skull. I do not remember going down. I remember the joists under my cheek smelling of 130 years of cedar and dust, and Danny's hands turning me onto my back, and the sky through the unfinished roof gray and ordinary. The last ordinary thing I saw that day. I remember someone's phone pressed against my ear while the paramedics worked. Danny dialing Vivian and holding it there because my own hands would not cooperate. It rang 4 times and went to her voicemail. Her recorded voice, bright and unbothered, asking the caller to leave a message after the tone. Nobody left one. There did not seem to be a message small enough for what was happening on that floor. The ride to the hospital exists only in pieces now. Fluorescent lights sliding past overhead in a rhythm I tried out of old habit to count and measure, like a man leveling a wall. A paramedic's voice asking me to squeeze her hand if I understood her. The particular indignity of having your good work shirt cut open by strangers, the same shirt I had put on that morning, without knowing it would end the day in a bin marked biohazard. I surfaced properly sometime after dark, in a room that smelled like antiseptic instead of cedar, tethered to machines that beeped in a rhythm entirely unlike the one I knew. Roz was there at some point that first evening, her hand resting on the bed rail, her voice low and steady the way it always was in a crisis. She told me the crew had finished the seam without me, that the house was fine, that I should worry about myself, for once in my life, instead of a chimney. I drifted the way sedated men drift, surfacing and sinking time, moving in a current I could not read or steer. At some point, deep in that current past midnight by the clock, I couldn't quite bring into focus. I came up enough to hear voices in the hallway outside my door, close enough that the wall did nothing to soften them. One of the voices was Vivian's. I knew it the way you know weather without needing to look. What I did not know, what pulled me up out of the current for one clear, terrible second, was the sound underneath her words. Warm. Low. The particular register a person uses with someone they are trying not to wake the whole hallway for. I heard her say Desmond's name, soft as a held breath. Softer than she had ever once said mine in 30 years of marriage. I heard the word paperwork, Or perhaps documents I could never afterward be certain, which threaded through a sentence about not worrying him with the details while he's like this. I tried to open my eyes fully, to place a face to the second voice answering hers, low and unhurried, in the way of a man used to being listened to without having to raise his volume. The heart monitor beside me kept its steady mechanical rhythm. The morphine kept its promise. I went back under before I could be certain of anything at all, telling myself, even as the dark closed over me, that grief and fever and a body full of medication make a man hear all manner of things that were never truly said in the first place. Weller. I thought somewhere in that last conscious second, though, I could not have told you why the name surfaced or what it had to do with a hallway outside a cardiac unit. A man in a clean shirt saying the word prove like it was a hammer he enjoyed swinging. Then nothing. Then morning, and a nurse changing an IV bag, and no memory at all of having thought of my father twice in one day, for reasons I did not yet have the shape of. They kept me in the hospital 4 days, and kept me out of the office for 6 weeks after that, which felt to a man like me somewhere between a mercy and a punishment. Cardiac rehabilitation is its own kind of labor, slower than any wall I ever built, measured out in minutes on a treadmill instead of feet of finished brick. I learned to be patient with my own body in a way I had never once been patient with anything else in 63 years, counting heartbeats the way I used to count courses of brick, one at a time. No shortcuts, no skipping ahead. Vivian was in those first weeks exactly the wife a man hopes for when his heart has just tried to quit on him. She brought me broth I didn't ask for, and sat with me through afternoons I couldn't fill with anything useful, and if I noticed a certain distance behind her attention, the way you notice a draft in a house without being able to name which window it's coming through, I told myself it was only my own fear talking. Grief does that to a man. So does a body that has just learned it is not invincible. It was Desmond who started coming around most in those weeks. He had handled Cornerstone's contracts for going on 3 years by then, careful and precise in a way I had genuinely respected, and it seemed only natural that a company recovering from its founder's heart attack would lean harder on its lawyer for a while. He took meetings I was too tired to sit through. He told me more than once with a kind of gentle firmness I mistook for competence that I should let him carry the weight until I was stronger. That worrying about business was the last thing my cardiologist would want for me. I let him. God help me, I let him, because it was easier than fighting my own exhaustion, and because Vivian seemed so relieved every time he took something off my plate. There was an afternoon, maybe 5 weeks in, when I came downstairs for water, and found a manila folder open on the kitchen table, dense with pages I didn't recognize, Vivian's reading glasses resting on top like a paperweight. "What's all that?" I asked her, and she closed the folder before I'd finished the question, quick and practiced, the way you'd shut a drawer on something you didn't want a child to find. "Nothing worth troubling a recovering heart over," she said, smiling the smile she used at charity dinners, the one that had a shine to it, but no real weather underneath. "Just some tedious insurance restructuring Desmond's walking me through. You know I've never had a head for that side of things. Let me carry it for once." I believed her. I want that on the record, whatever record a man like me gets to keep. I believed her the way I had believed her for 30 years, because the alternative required a kind of suspicion I had never once needed to carry into that kitchen before, and because some part of me, still weak from a hospital bed, was grateful to have one less thing asked of my hands. Desmond had started using my home office by then too, on the afternoons he came by, saying it made more sense than spreading papers across the kitchen table where I might trip over them. I came down once, still moving slow, and found him behind my own desk in my own chair, my father's old level hanging on the wall above his head, like it was decorating someone else's office now. He stood the moment he saw me, apologized, called it a temporary convenience. I told him not to worry about it. That is a sentence I said to that man more times in 6 weeks than I had said it to any living soul in 63 years. And I did not once stop to ask myself why I kept needing to say it. Some nights lying awake with the monitor's phantom beep still ringing somewhere behind my ribs, I would think of a hallway outside a cardiac unit, and a voice saying Desmond's name the way you'd say a secret. I told myself the way I'd told myself a dozen times by then, that fever and morphine make liars of even our own memories, that a sick man hears all manner of things that were never truly said. It is a remarkable thing, the stories a frightened man will tell himself to keep sleeping through the night. Roz was the only one who never fully settled into the new arrangement. She came by the house twice that first month under the excuse of bringing paperwork I could sign from my armchair, and both times she lingered a moment too long at the door, like there was a second thing she'd come to say, and couldn't quite land on the words for it. Once she mentioned almost in passing that 2 vendor accounts had been restructured without her sign-off while I was in the hospital. Standard practice for continuity. Desmond had told her nothing to worry the boss with. I told her not to worry the boss with it either. I remember saying at the particular tiredness in my own voice, a man still learning to walk half a city block without his chest tightening, choosing the smaller battle because the larger one felt, God forgive me, entirely invented. By the 6th week, my cardiologist cleared me for light duty and for what he called low-stress social obligations, with the same tired warning he'd repeat a month later before the anniversary itself. Keep your stress down, Mr. Sorensen. I told him a 30-year wedding anniversary was about as low stress as an evening gets, and we both had a small laugh about that. The kind of laugh a man permits himself right before life proves him spectacularly wrong. Vivian threw herself into planning the party, the way she threw herself into every event with her name attached to it. 3 ring binders of vendor quotes, a florist flown in from Houston, a guest list that read like a ledger of every favor either of us had ever owed anyone in Galveston. She wanted the Tremont Grand specifically. She said it would mean something, celebrating 30 years inside a ballroom I had personally saved from ruin. And I remember hearing her say it, something close to pride swell up under the healing scar in my chest. I should have asked her that day what exactly 30 years had come to mean to her by then. I did not ask. I was too busy being grateful to still be alive to ask it, too busy believing that a woman planning her husband's survival party could not possibly be the same woman planning anything else. The night of the anniversary, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror longer than I had in years, straightening a tie Vivian had picked out weeks earlier, feeling stronger in my own body than I had any right to feel 6 months removed from a hospital bed. My hands, at least, had not changed. The calluses were still there, the same ones my father used to press his thumb against when I was a boy, telling me a man's hands would always tell the truth about him, even when the rest of him learned lie. I looked. I remember thinking like a man who had survived something. I had no idea yet how small a thing I had actually survived compared to what was waiting for me under 200 pairs of eyes and a ballroom full of candlelight I had once saved with those same 2 hands. Neither of us spoke on the drive home. Vivian sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking out at the dark storefronts of the Strand sliding past. And I drove with both hands on the wheel, the way I always drive, careful, deliberate, the way a man drives when he does not entirely trust what he'll do with his hands if he lets his attention wander. I kept waiting for her to say something, anything. Some version of an explanation offered before I had to ask for one. She never did. She watched the storefronts instead, and somewhere around the 3rd stoplight I understood that the silence itself was its own kind of answer. The particular silence of a woman who has already said everything she plans to say and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. She went straight for the kitchen when we got in, poured herself a glass of water she didn't drink, stood at the counter with her back half turned toward me. I stood in the doorway, still wearing my jacket, still holding absurdly the little printed card from the centerpiece that someone had pressed into my hand on the way out. What did you mean? I asked her. Protected. She didn't turn around right away. When she did, her face had none of the ballroom brightness left in it, just a flat, tired kind of calm. The calm of a woman who has rehearsed a conversation enough times that the real version feels almost like relief. It means what it means, Emmett. The company needed restructuring. Desmond's advised us for years. He knows the tax exposure better than either of us, and he thought, given everything with your heart, it made sense to move sooner rather than later. Us, I said. I noticed that word. Advised us. He's been advising the family, Vivian said. And there was no flicker in her when she said it, not one. That's what a family lawyer does. I looked past her into the hallway, toward the half-open door of my home office, and something in me reached for the smaller wound instead of the larger one. The way a man will grab the handrail before he lets himself look down. "Somebody moved my father's level," I said. "It used to hang on the left side of the window. It's on the right now." She stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language in the middle of a house fire. "Desmond needed the light for reading contracts," she said. "I told him it was fine to move it." "You told him." "It's a level, Emmett. It measures whether a wall is straight. It isn't a family heirloom." "It was my father's," I said, and I heard my own voice come out smaller than I meant it to. Smaller than 63 years and a company worth $40 million had any right to sound. It's the only thing of his I have left that still works the way it's supposed to. I almost asked her then about the calls. About the nights her phone would light up on the nightstand past 11, and she'd carry it out onto the porch to take it, always with the same explanation ready before I'd even asked. Always Desmond, always something urgent about a filing deadline that couldn't wait for morning. I had the question sitting right behind my teeth. What I said instead was that I didn't appreciate finding another man's coffee mug drying in my dish rack like he lived there. Vivian's mouth tightened, the first real crack in her composure all night. "He works late sometimes," she said. "I offer him coffee. That's called being a decent host, Emmett, not a crime." Vivian set her water glass down harder than the moment called for. "And there it is," she said. 30 years, and you're standing in our kitchen the night of our anniversary upset about a coffee mug and a level." "I'm not upset about a coffee mug." "Then what are you upset about? Say it. Say the actual thing." I did not say the actual thing. I want that on the record too. I stood in that kitchen, with a hallway outside a cardiac unit sitting behind my teeth, a woman's warm voice saying another man's name the way you'd say a secret. And I let the coffee mug be the thing I was angry about. Because the mug was small enough to hold, and the other thing was not. A man can carry a great deal of weight, I have learned, so long as he is careful never to name it out loud. "I want a divorce," she said, into the silence I left for her. "Not tonight, not dramatically. I've wanted one for a while now, if I'm honest, and tonight simply made it easier to finally say so out loud." The house was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator cycling on in the other room. "Easier," I said, "because you've already made sure there's almost nothing left to divide." She didn't deny it. That more than anything else that night is the part I have turned over the most since. She simply looked at me steady, unashamed, and said the thing I believe she had been carrying for longer than either of us wanted to admit. "I have spent 30 years watching you love a trowel more than you ever loved a boardroom, Emmett. I have sat through banquet after banquet, listening to men half your worth talk down to you because your hands are rough, and I have defended you every single time, and somewhere in there, I got tired of being the only one who understood that you were worth defending. I am 58 years old. I would like, for whatever time I have left, to be with a man the room respects the moment he walks into it. Not one it has to be reminded to." 30 years, I said. "You lived inside every house those hands ever built." "I know what they built," she said. "I have simply never once needed to touch them to enjoy it." I did not answer that. There are sentences a man hears exactly once in his life that rearrange every room he has ever stood in. And I understood hearing that one, that I would be arranging furniture around the wreckage of it for however many years I had left. I thought of my father in the yard the winter we lost the house, the particular stillness in his shoulders when he finally stopped arguing with the man in the clean shirt, and simply turned to load the truck. I set the little printed centerpiece card down on the counter between us, still creased from where I'd been holding it. I did not say the thing about the hospital hallway. I did not say Desmond's name. I understood some small, cold part of me that saying it now would only prove to her I'd known for months and chosen, like my father before me, to trust a handshake over the evidence in front of my own 2 eyes. I walked out of that kitchen without another word past the office, where a stranger's chair sat pushed in at my desk, and my father's level still hung on the wrong side of the window, out the back door into the humid Galveston dark, toward the one room in that house I still fully trusted. My workshop light clicked on, the way it always had, faithful, uncomplicated, no explanations required of it. I stood there a long moment before I let myself reach for anything at all. The trowel was hanging exactly where I'd left it, on its nail beside the window, worn smooth in the exact places my hand had worn it smooth for 40 years. I did not turn on the radio. I did not sit down. I simply stood in the smell of sawdust and dried mortar until my own breathing found something close to its old patient rhythm again. A man alone in the one room that had never once asked him to be anyone other than what his hands had made of him. Roz's office still smelled like the coffee she'd been brewing too strong since 1999, and when I walked in the next morning without calling ahead, she took one look at my face and cleared her desk without a word, the way you'd clear a table for a man about to be sick. Behind her, on the shelf where most people her age had long since gone fully digital, sat the same green ledger book she'd kept by hand for 22 years, running parallel to every spreadsheet the company had ever adopted, in case she always said the machines ever decided to lie to us. I want to see everything I told her. Every account, every signature, every piece of paper that moved while I was in that hospital bed. All of it. She didn't ask why. That is one of the things I have always trusted about Roz Calloway, 22 years of her not asking why when a man's face has already answered the question for him. She pulled a banker's box down from the shelf behind her, the physical file she still kept parallel to the digital one, because a computer crash had never once worried her the way it worried younger men, and set it on the desk between us like a coroner laying out evidence. The first document was a limited power of attorney dated 3 years earlier. My own signature at the bottom, in the particular slant it takes when I sign something I've read carefully and trust completely. Roz tapped it with one finger. "You signed this back when we did the Ball Street refinancing," she said. "Standard business continuity language in case you were ever incapacitated and the company needed someone authorized to keep operations running. Desmond drafted it. You signed it in about 4 minutes flat because you trusted him." I remembered signing it. I remembered thinking at the time what a responsible thing it was to have in place the kind of foresight my father never had the luxury of affording. I remembered Desmond's exact words that day, something about how a good businessman plans for his own worst week the same way he plans for a hurricane insurance you hope you never need. I had thought, God help me, that he was talking about my safety. I did not remember until that morning that the document named Vivian as the authorized party, with the right to delegate signing authority to counsel of her choosing in the event of my incapacity. "She used it," I said. "While I was under sedation, while a man I trusted with my company sat in my own chair using my own light." Roz nodded slow, like a woman delivering test results she'd already read twice, hoping they'd change the second time. "Legally, yes. Every signature transferring operational control of Cornerstone during those 6 weeks traces back to that one document. It's clean, Emmett. I had 2 outside attorneys look at it overnight, off the books, and both of them told me the same thing. There's no fraud here in the eyes of the law. Just a man who trusted his wife enough to give her the keys before he ever imagined needing to take them back." I sat with that a long moment. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. 68%, I said. "Is there any lever left to pull, any argument? You could contest capacity at the time of some individual transfers," she said, "if we can show specific signatures happened while you were sedated, rather than simply covered by the standing authorization. It would take months. It would mean depositions, medical records, probably your own cardiologist. On a witness stand describing exactly how helpless you were in that bed, it might work, it might not. And Emmett, I have to be honest with you because it's what you pay me for. Even if it works, it splits the company right down the middle in the process. There won't be a Cornerstone left worth winning by the time anybody's done arguing over who it belongs to. So sit on it," I said. "Negotiate quiet. Let the lawyers handle it behind closed doors, and hope nobody outside this building ever has to know the founder's wife emptied him out while his heart was still stitched together." "That's one option," Roz said carefully. "It's the option most men in your position choose. Fewer headlines, fewer whispers at church. You keep some dignity intact in front of people who don't need to know the particulars. I thought about the 200 people in that ballroom clapping for a word they didn't understand. I thought about how easy it would be to let them keep believing whatever polite version eventually got repeated at the next dinner party. Some story about amicable separation and mutual respect. Everyone nodding along the way that room had nodded along to the word protected. It would have been the comfortable thing. It would have cost me almost nothing but the truth. I looked past her out the window at Broadway, at the oaks I used to climb as a boy, before I ever laid a single brick. And I thought about my father standing in that yard, refusing even then, even ruined, to raise his voice at a man who was robbing him blind, because raising his voice would have meant admitting in front of the whole street that he'd been foolish enough to trust a handshake. I am not going to do that, I told her. Roz waited. I would rather lose every dollar of this company in the full light of what actually happened than keep half of it standing on a lie everybody agrees to nod along with. I watched my father do the quiet version his whole life, Roz. Swallow it, keep working, let the man in the clean shirt keep his reputation intact because making noise wasn't the respectable thing to do. I am 63 years old. I would rather be the poor, loud fool than the quiet, comfortable one. Something in Roz's face shifted then. Not quite a smile, something closer to relief. All right, she said. Then we do this the hard way. I'll get the divorce filing moving this week, and I'll start pulling every transaction from those 6 weeks, line by line, whether it's covered by that power of attorney or not. If there's a crack in this anywhere, I intend to find it before Desmond Whitfield gets a full night's sleep again. She said it the way she used to talk about a foundation pour gone wrong. All business, no wasted sympathy. And I was grateful for it. I have never needed anyone to feel sorry for me. I have only ever needed someone willing to keep pulling on a thread until it either broke clean or led somewhere. She was already reaching for a second folder when she paused, frowning slightly. One finger stopped on a line item near the bottom of a transfer log. This one's odd, she said. This particular filing, the one moving the bulk of the Cornerstone shares. It's dated the same week you were still in the hospital. Sure, that part tracks. But the notary stamp on it is from a public notary 2 counties over, in Chambers County. Not here in Galveston, where Desmond usually has everything notarized. I don't know why that would be. Might be nothing. In 22 years of keeping your books, though, I've learned that nothing usually has a reason behind it somewhere. I turned the page toward myself and looked at that unfamiliar seal for a long moment. The raised letters catching the office light at an angle. Chambers County meant nothing to me at all. Not one job we'd ever worked there, not one client, not one reason. A Galveston attorney would drive 40 minutes inland to have a Galveston company's shares notarized by a stranger. I did not know what to make of it yet either. I only knew, looking at that stamp, that it was the first thread in the whole ugly fabric of it that didn't quite lie flat. And that some part of me, the same part that used to check a wall twice before trusting it plumb, had already decided not to let it go. Marlene Kessler had a corner office 2 floors above the county courthouse. Framed diplomas from 3 universities on the wall, and a way of delivering bad financial news that reminded me, oddly, of a doctor reading an X-ray. Careful. Unhurried. No wasted sympathy that might make a man mistake her for someone who could change what the picture showed. Roz had recommended her personally. Told me once that Marlene had represented 3 different Galveston families through ugly divorces, and never once lost her composure in a courtroom. Which I found that particular morning to be exactly the kind of steadiness I had none of left in myself. She shook my hand with a grip firmer than most contractors I'd ever hired, and I remember thinking absurdly that I trusted her more in that single handshake than I had trusted anyone else in this whole ordeal so far. Roz had sent over everything the night before, including that odd notary stamp from Chambers County, and Marlene had a photocopy of it clipped to her legal pad when I sat down. A small red flag stuck to the corner, like a warning label. We'll come back to that stamp, she told me, tapping it once. It's the kind of loose thread that either unravels nothing or unravels everything. I don't want you building your hopes on it yet. I also don't want you forgetting it exists. Let's talk about what's actually yours, she said next, sliding a single typed page across the desk toward me. Not what you built. What's legally, unambiguously yours the moment this divorce is finalized and that power of attorney stops mattering. I read it twice. It did not take long to read twice. The truck, she said, tapping the first line. Your personal tools itemized separately, since a court has never once in my career tried to claim a man's hand tools as marital property. The cabin out on Bolivar. Your father left you before any of this marriage started, which stays entirely yours because it predates the union and was never folded into Cornerstone's holdings. About $60,000 in a personal savings account, Vivian's name was never on. And that Emmett, as far as I can find, is the whole of it. $60,000, I said. Out of a company worth $40 million. She didn't flinch from the number, which I respected even in the state I was in. The shares transferred under that power of attorney, the real estate holdings, the operating accounts, all of it, sits as of this morning under Vivian's control or the trust structure Desmond built around it. I won't candy-coat this for you. On paper you are, for the moment, a man with a truck, a toolbox, a fishing cabin, and $60,000. I sat with that number a long moment. The particular silence of a man doing arithmetic he already knows the answer to. 40 years, I said. 40 years of pouring foundations, and 40 years reduces to a truck and a toolbox. I thought sitting there of a question I did not yet have words sharp enough to ask out loud. Something about whether a man who built a thing with his own hands could ever truly be said to have lost it, even when every deed and every share certificate said otherwise. It felt at the time like the kind of thought a man tells himself to survive an afternoon. I did not yet know how much weight that question would eventually come to carry. Marlene closed the folder gently the way you'd close a casket lid. It reduces to what's provable, she said. Those are different things, and I intend to spend the coming months making sure the court understands the difference. This will take time, Emmett. Depositions, forensic accountants, probably a fight over whether that Chambers County notary was even licensed to operate the day this was signed. I'd be doing you a disservice if I let you leave this office today, thinking any of it was going to be quick or clean or anything close to fair on its face. I thanked her. I remember standing to leave, my hand already on the door, when she added one more thing almost gently, the closest she came all afternoon to sounding like something other than a lawyer. Go home and do whatever it is you do with your hands when the rest of the world stops making sense, Emmett. You've got a long fight ahead of you. There's no shame in resting the tools before you pick them back up. I did not tell her I intended to do exactly the opposite. Some men rest their tools when the world stops making sense. I have only ever known how to pick mine up harder. I do not remember much of the drive after that. Only that my hands found their way without any real decision on my part toward Ball Street instead of home. Toward the first building I had ever restored entirely on my own, the narrow storefront I still kept the lease on. 11 years after I'd stopped needing the extra workspace because some rooms. A man simply cannot make himself give up. I let myself in with the same brass key I'd carried since 1991, and the door stuck the same half-inch it always had. Swollen with 30 years of Gulf humidity, no amount of planing had ever fully cured. The place still smelled the way it had the day I signed the lease. Lime and dust, and the particular mustiness of a building that had stood through 4 hurricanes and outlasted every one of them. My very first paying client, a widow named Constance Beaumont, had hired me to save this exact storefront's facade. And I had been so nervous the morning I started that I mixed my first batch of mortar wrong twice before Constance, watching from a folding chair on the sidewalk, told me to slow down and let my hands remember what they already knew. Constance passed on years ago now, but I had kept the lease going long after her estate sold the building to someone else entirely. Some quiet arrangement between the new owner and me that had less to do with practicality than with a man's need for one room in the world that had never once changed its opinion of him. I stood in the doorway a long moment before I did anything else, letting my eyes adjust, letting 30 years settle back around me, the way they always did in that particular light. The back wall still held the crack it had held for 6 years, a hairline seam, near the base where the old foundation had settled just enough to open the mortar. Small enough that no client had ever noticed it, large enough that I had. I mixed a small batch by hand. The ratio, unmeasured muscle memory doing the counting, my mind had no room left for. I knelt at the base of the wall. I loaded the trowel. I pressed the mortar into the seam twice, the blade finding the old rhythm without asking my permission. I struck the joint level with one clean pass. I smoothed it. I did not think about Vivian. I did not think about $60,000 or $40 million or a stamp from Chambers County. The light through the transom window went from gold to gray while I worked, and somewhere in that hour I reached over without looking and clicked off the overhead bulb, finishing the last inch of the seam by feel alone in the near dark, the way my father taught me to check a joint before he ever taught me to admire one. The only sound left in that narrow room was the trowel touching brick. Roz called me 4 days later, not with her usual business-like opening, but with a single sentence that told me everything before I'd even sat down. "You need to come in, Emmett, today if you can." Her office looked different when I walked in that afternoon, the green ledger pushed to one side. 3 separate legal pads fanned out across the desk, instead of her usual single notebook. Each one covered in the dense, slanted handwriting she only produced when a problem had kept her up past midnight. The coffee pot in the corner had gone cold hours earlier. A full carafe sitting untouched, which told me more than her face did about how long she'd actually been at this. She had the transfer log spread across her desk when I arrived, the same log we'd looked at together the week before, except now every date on it was circled in red pen, arrows connecting one circle to another in a pattern I couldn't yet read. I went back through everything she said without any preamble at all. Every filing, every timestamp, cross-referenced against the hotel's own event records for the anniversary. I wanted to understand exactly when each piece of this actually happened, not just what the paperwork claimed happened. I called the hotel's event coordinator myself yesterday, told her I was confirming details for an insurance claim, and got her to walk me through the exact timeline of that evening, down to when the toast was scheduled and when it actually happened. "Sit down," she added, which was not something Roz Calloway said to me often. I sat. "Vivian told that whole ballroom the transfer happened that morning," she said. "As of this morning, 68% for tax purposes. That's what she said word for word according to 3 different people I called who were sitting close enough to hear her clearly." "That's what she said," I agreed. "It isn't true," Roz said. "The Chambers County filing, the one with the notary stamp that didn't sit right with me, it's timestamped November the 9th. 11 days before the party, Emmett. Not that morning, 11 days earlier. Whatever your wife stood up and announced to 200 people, the actual transfer was already old news by the time she said a single word about it." I sat with that a moment, feeling something shift under the anger I'd already been carrying. A colder, more clinical kind of anger I did not entirely recognize in myself. "It wasn't a decision she made that morning," I said. "It was a performance. Rehearsed, timed, scheduled around a room full of witnesses she knew would clap before they understood what they were clapping for. It was theater," Roz said. "My best guess, and it's only a guess, is that announcing it publicly, with witnesses framed as a generous, transparent gesture between loving spouses, gave her a kind of social cover. 200 people now remember a wife being open and above board about a difficult financial decision. 200 people did not see a transfer that had already been quietly completed nearly 2 weeks earlier, while you were still learning to trust your own legs again after a heart attack." I thought about the room clapping. I thought about the word protected, said out loud in front of my own crew, my own friends, while the actual theft had already been sitting in a filing cabinet in Chambers County for 11 days, waiting for its moment to be dressed up as generosity. My father used to say a man could always tell the difference between a wall that was actually plumb and one that only looked plumb from the doorway you simply had to walk the length of it and check. I had walked the length of my marriage exactly once standing in that ballroom, and I had checked nothing. I had simply trusted the doorway view the way I had trusted 100 doorway views before it, because the alternative had always felt until that moment like an insult to 30 years of otherwise good evidence. "There's something else," Roz said, and her voice changed register slightly, the way it did when she was about to hand me something she hadn't fully made sense of herself yet. I kept pulling the thread on that transfer, following where the shares actually landed once they left Cornerstone's books. I expected to find your wife's name on the receiving end. 68% sitting cleanly under Vivian Sorensen, easy enough to understand even if it made me sick to look at.
That isn't what you found, I said.
It's not that simple, she said. The shares didn't go to Vivian directly. They went first into an entity called Gulf Coast Legacy Holdings, formed 9 months ago, registered agent out of Houston. From there, Gulf Coast Legacy transferred controlling interest into a second entity, Harborview Family Trust, formed the same week. And Harborview, as far as I can trace it, is the entity that actually holds your 68% today. My first thought, God forgive the smallness of it, was that Desmond had simply built himself a fortress to hide behind, some shell he controlled personally, so that even Vivian would eventually have to come to him for what was rightfully hers. It would have made a certain ugly sense, a lawyer clever enough to draft a power of attorney 3 years in advance, being clever enough to eventually cut his own lover out of the very scheme he'd built for her. I said as much out loud, almost relieved to have a shape to put to my anger, even an ugly one. It's not him either, Roz said before I'd even finished the thought. I checked. Desmond Whitfield's name doesn't appear anywhere on the Harborview paperwork, not as trustee, not as beneficiary, not as so much as a witness signature. Whoever built this trust went out of their way to keep his name off it entirely, which is, if you think about it, a strange thing for a man to do with something he supposedly built to protect his own future. She turned the legal pad around so I could read her own notes. A chain of holding entities, stacked one on top of another, the kind of structure I'd seen before in commercial real estate deals, but never once expected to find wrapped around my own company. At the bottom of that chain, past 2 shell entities I didn't recognize, and 1 blind trust registered out of a P.O. box in Chambers County, sat a name typed in plain block letters at the top of a trustee designation form. I read it twice the way I'd read Marlene's list of what remained mine twice because some sentences require a second pass before a man's mind will accept what's actually printed on the page. This isn't Vivian's name, Roz said quietly, watching my face rather than the pad. It isn't Desmond's either. I sat there in that quiet office, the cold coffee, the red circles, the 3 tired legal pads, and felt the whole shape of what I'd believed about this betrayal shift under me, one more time, the ground still not done moving. Eudora Whitfield. Roz said the name out loud before I'd even finished reading it myself, testing it against her own memory, the way you'd test a board for rot, tapping it once to see if it held any weight. She recognized. I don't know that name, I said. Neither did I at first, Roz said, already turning to her computer. Give me a minute. It did not take her a minute. It took her closer to 20, most of it spent muttering under her breath at property records and a genealogy database she'd apparently used before for exactly this kind of digging, county archives, old school district personnel files, a handful of newspaper archives from decades back, until she finally turned the monitor toward me with something like grim satisfaction on her face. Eudora Whitfield, 79 years old, she said. Retired public school teacher. 31 years with Galveston Independent School District, mostly high school English. By the look of these old district newsletters, there's a photo here from a retirement banquet in 2009. A whole page of former students thanking her for making them read something called The Good Earth. Widowed, 11 years now. Her husband was a shrimper, died of a stroke out on the water. 1 son. She let that last part sit a moment before she said the rest of it. Desmond Whitfield's mother, she said. This entire trust, 68% of your company is sitting in the name of your wife's lawyer's own mother. I did not say anything for a while. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a man when a piece finally clicks into a puzzle he didn't know he was still holding, and it is not contrary to what people expect a silence with any relief in it. He used his own mother, I finally said. To hide it from his own mistress. Or to hide it from you, Roz said. Or from both of you. I don't know yet which. What I do know is that a 79-year-old retired school teacher does not accidentally end up holding $40 million of controlling interest in a real estate company she has, as far as I can find, no professional connection to whatsoever. She turned back to her keyboard, still restless, still pulling threads the way she'd been pulling them for days now, and stopped again, almost immediately. This time, with a different sound in her throat, something closer to surprise than satisfaction. "This is strange," she said. I pulled county records, going back on Eudora Whitfield's name, just to see what else surfaces. There's an old document here, notarized 19 years ago, a witness signature on a business formation filing for one of Desmond's very first clients, back when he was fresh out of law school, working out of a shared office downtown. Eudora Whitfield's signature is right there on the witness line, in the same careful school teacher's hand she probably used to sign report cards for 3 decades. "I don't follow," I said. "Notarizing or witnessing your own son's early paperwork isn't unusual," Roz said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. "Family helps family, especially a young lawyer just starting out, short on staff, short on money for a proper notary on retainer. But it tells me this isn't the first time Desmond's put his mother's name on something official. Whatever's happening now with your company, it may not be the first time he's used her like this, quietly, for convenience. Maybe never once fully explaining what she was actually signing. Whether she understood what she was signing back then, or understands what she's holding now, is a very different question, and it's the one I can't answer from a database." I thought of the note Vivian had pressed into my hand at the ballroom door on the way out, the guest list she'd shown me weeks earlier while planning the party, 200 names I'd half read and mostly forgotten. Eudora Whitfield had not been on it. I was certain of that, the way I was certain of very little else that week. Whatever role she was playing in this, nobody had thought to seat her at the party where the whole scheme had been announced. "I want to see her," I said. "Not to accuse her of anything yet. I just want to see the woman who's apparently holding my company in her name." Roz gave me the address without much argument. A modest street in the older part of town. Nowhere near the gated neighborhood where Desmond kept his own house. Nowhere near the kind of address you'd expect for a woman sitting on paper atop $40 million. I drove out there that same afternoon, telling myself the whole way that I only meant to look, not to knock, not to accuse a stranger of anything on her own front lawn. The house, when I found it, was a small, clapboard place with a covered porch and a yard kept neater than half the historic properties I'd ever restored for paying clients. Hedges trimmed, square a bed of zinnias along the walk, in colors that told me somebody out there still cared deeply and personally about small and ordinary things. I slowed the truck without quite meaning to. Eudora Whitfield was in that yard when I passed a woman with white hair pulled back, simply a wide straw hat, moving along her flower bed, with a watering can in one hand and the unhurried patience of someone who had spent an entire life tending things slowly and expecting them to grow. She paused once to deadhead a spent bloom, tucking it into her apron pocket rather than dropping it on the ground. The small, particular tidiness of a woman who had likely spent 31 years training teenagers to pick up after themselves and had never once stopped practicing it herself. She did not look from that distance, from that ordinary porch, like a woman capable of anchoring a $40 million fraud. She looked like every retired teacher I had ever met at every school fundraiser Vivian had ever dragged me to, exactly the kind of woman you'd trust to watch your house while you were out of town. The kind who still sent birthday cards to former students 40 years after they'd left her classroom. I did not stop the truck. I told myself it was because I had no plan yet for what to say to her. No way to walk up a strange woman's front path and ask whether she understood that her name was sitting on paperwork worth more than her house, her street, and probably her entire town combined. That was true as far as it went. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that some part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime reading people the way I read a wall before I ever trusted it to hold weight, had looked at Eudora Whitfield deadheading zinnias in a straw hat and felt against every ounce of anger I was still carrying something closer to sympathy than suspicion. My father used to say you could always tell a load-bearing wall from a decorative one by how it behaved under pressure, not by how it looked standing still. I did not yet know which kind of wall Eudora Whitfield was going to turn out to be. I only knew watching her tend that flower bed that she did not look like a woman who had ever once been told the truth about what she was actually holding up. I drove 3 blocks past her house before I let myself pull over, park, and simply sit there a long moment with both hands still on the wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled, the whole quiet street going about its ordinary Tuesday afternoon around me. I would go back, I decided. Not today. Not with Roz's files spread across my dashboard like an accusation. I would go back the way you approach any wall you suspect might be carrying more weight than it was ever built to hold. Carefully from the outside first, before you ever put your full trust in it again. Roz called me that evening, before I'd even made it home. Her voice carrying the particular urgency of a woman who has spent the afternoon thinking through every angle of a problem and arrived somewhere she didn't like. I could hear her office in the background, the particular hum of the old window unit she'd never replaced in 22 years, and I pictured her still at her desk, long after everyone else in the building had gone home for the evening.
"Hand it to Marlene tomorrow morning," she said, no preamble at all. "All of it. The Harborview filing, the Chambers County notary, Eudora Whitfield's name, everything. Let her subpoena the woman properly. Get her under oath, with a court reporter in the room. That's how this gets done safely, Emmett." I told her I understood the logic of it. I did. A subpoena was clean. A subpoena was the kind of paper trail my whole defense would eventually rest on, official and dated and impossible for anyone to later claim hadn't happened the way it happened. "I'm going to see her myself first," I said anyway. Roz was quiet on the other end of the line long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Emmett," she finally said, "that's not a legal strategy. That's you driving out to a stranger's house to have a conversation that could tip off Desmond before we're ready. That could give Vivian's side of this a chance to coach her before Marlene ever gets a subpoena served." "I know what it could do," I said. "I want to do it anyway." Why, Roz said, and it wasn't really a question, more an invitation for me to explain myself to myself as much as to her. I thought about how to answer that honestly, standing in my own kitchen, with the phone against my ear, looking at the space on the wall where a level used to hang, on the left side of a window instead of the right. My father spent the last year of his working life being treated like a line item, I said. A dispute to be managed, a claim to be denied, a name on a piece of paper some contractor's lawyer never had to look in the eye. Nobody ever sat down across from him and asked what actually happened, what he understood, what he thought he was agreeing to when he shook that man's hand. They just sent paper, and when the paper said he had no case, that was the end of it, as far as anyone with power in that transaction was concerned. Roz didn't interrupt. I have always been grateful to her for that, the particular skill of knowing when a man needs to finish a thought before he can hear anything said back to him. "I'm not going to do that to Eudora Whitfield," I said. "Whatever she turns out to be in all this, whatever she knew or didn't know, I am going to be the first person in this entire mess who sits down across from her as a human being before anyone shows up with a subpoena and starts treating her like a line item too." Roz let out a breath, long and slow, the sound of a woman recalculating risk in real time. "And if she's lying to your face the whole time," she said, "if she's not the innocent widow in the flower bed at all, if this whole quiet, sympathetic approach of yours is exactly what a woman like that would count on from a man like you, then I'll know that too," I said, by the end of the conversation. "I've spent 40 years reading people's faces while they tell me what's wrong with a house that's about to fall down around their ears, Roz. I trust my own eyes more than I trust a subpoena to tell me the truth about a person." "That's a hell of a gamble," she said. "It's not a gamble," I said. "It's a choice. I would rather find out who Eudora Whitfield actually is by looking her in the eye than win this whole fight using the same cold, faceless methods that were used against my father. Even if the methods are legal, even if they're the ones Marlene would tell me to use." Roz was quiet again, and when she finally spoke, some of the argument had gone out of her voice, replaced by something closer to resignation. And underneath that, I think, something closer to respect. "At least let me know when you're going," she said. "And Emmett, if she slams the door in your face, or worse, calls Desmond the second you're back in your truck, don't be surprised. People protect their own blood before they protect the truth.
Every single time in my experience. Maybe I said. Or maybe somebody's finally going to give her the chance to choose differently. I did not sleep well that night, turning the coming conversation over and over the way I used to turn over a difficult repair the night before I started it. Trying to see the whole job in my mind before I ever touched the first brick. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep entirely and sat in the dark kitchen instead, running through every version of the conversation I could imagine. The gentle ones, and the ones where she slammed the door before I'd finished my first sentence. I drove out to her street the next morning, before I'd fully decided what I would say, parked 2 houses down the way I had the first time, and sat there watching the early light come up soft and gray over her small, tidy yard. The zinnias were still there, dead-headed and neat. A wind chime on her porch moved once in a breeze I couldn't feel from inside the truck. I got out. I walked the length of her front path, the way you'd walk the length of a wall you weren't yet sure would hold your weight. Slow, deliberate, checking the ground beneath each step before committing to the next one. I climbed the 2 porch steps, the wood giving slightly under my boots, in a way that told me, out of old habit, exactly how many more years these particular boards had left in them. I raised my hand and set it flat against her front door. Not yet knocking, just feeling the solid, ordinary wood under my palm. The particular stillness of a threshold a man hasn't crossed yet. She opened the door before I'd even knocked, which told me she'd been watching me walk up the path the whole time. The way careful people watch a stranger's approach without ever letting the stranger know they've been seen. Up close, she was smaller than she'd looked from the truck. But there was nothing frail in the way she held the door. One hand steady on the frame, sizing me up without a trace of the nervousness I'd half expected from a woman alone in her own doorway.
Can I help you?
She asked, not unkindly. Just plainly a woman who had spent 31 years learning to size up an unfamiliar face in the space of a single sentence. My name is Emmett Sorensen, I said. I used to own, a company called Cornerstone Realty Group. I believe your name is currently attached to a great deal of it, and I don't think you know that yet. I'd like to talk with you if you'll let me, and I promise you I haven't come here to shout at anyone. Something moved across her face, not fear, exactly, more the particular alertness of a woman who has spent a lifetime recognizing when a simple sentence is about to reorganize an entire afternoon. She studied me a moment longer, glanced once past me toward the empty street, and stepped back to hold the door open. "You'd better come in then," she said. "I imagine this isn't a porch conversation." Her front room smelled like lemon polish and old books, shelves of them lining one whole wall, a photograph of a man in shrimper's waders smiling from a boat deck sitting in a place of honor on the mantel. Beside it, a smaller frame holding a school photograph of a boy who could only have been Desmond. At 7 or 8 years old, gap-toothed, grinning, entirely unremarkable in the way all boys that age are unremarkable. She gestured me toward a wingback chair and settled herself across from me, hands folded in her lap, waiting with the patience of a woman who had faced down 3 decades of teenagers and had long since stopped being rattled by an unfamiliar adult in her living room. "I brought copies," I said, and set the folder Roz had prepared on the low table between us, opening it slowly, giving her time. "This is a trust called Harborview Family Trust. Your name is listed as trustee. It currently holds 68% of the controlling interest in my company, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million. I watched her read it. I have spent 40 years watching people's faces while they absorb bad news about a house, a foundation, a roof that's about to fail them. And I recognize the particular sequence in hers: confusion first, then the slow dawning arithmetic of a woman realizing the sentence in front of her cannot possibly mean what it appears to mean. And then worst of all, the moment it finally does. "That isn't right," she said. "That can't be right. Desmond told me this was retirement paperwork. He said his firm was consolidating some clients' estate accounts under a family trustee structure for tax efficiency, and he needed a trustee they could all agree on, someone neutral, someone family. He said it was mostly ceremonial. He said I wouldn't have to do anything at all, just sign where he showed me and let the accountants handle the rest." "He told you it was retirement paperwork," I repeated. "He's my son," she said.
and there was something in her voice now that hadn't been there a moment earlier, a crack widening under 31 years of careful composure. I signed what he put in front of me. I have always signed what he puts in front of me. He's never once given me a reason not to. Not since he was a boy bringing home report cards for me to initial. She glanced without seeming to mean to at the small framed photograph on the mantel. The gap-toothed boy in the school portrait. He used to bring me his spelling tests before anyone else saw them, she said quieter now, as if she were speaking more to herself than to me. Wanted my approval before his father's, before anyone's. I taught him to read before he ever set foot in a kindergarten classroom. I do not know how to reconcile that boy with whatever this paperwork is telling me right now. I did not say anything. There are moments a man learns working in other people's ruined houses long enough, when the kindest thing he can do is simply hold still and let someone else's foundation finish settling before he says another word. "This isn't the first time, is it?" she said suddenly. And it took me a moment to understand she wasn't asking me a question so much as answering one she'd already been quietly turning over. Years ago, when he was first starting out, he brought me papers to witness for one of his early clients, told me it was just a formality, that a notary was expensive and inconvenient, and he trusted me to understand what I was signing better than any stranger with a stamp would. I signed that too. I never thought twice about it. I was proud of him. "I have people who found that document," I said gently. 19 years old. Your signature is on it." She sat very still for a long moment. Her hands, which had been folded so calmly a few minutes earlier, now pressed flat against her own knees, as if she needed something solid to push against. "I taught literature for 31 years, Mr. Sorensen," she finally said, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier composure. "I taught children to read, carefully, to ask who benefits from a story being told a certain way, to never simply trust the narrator just because the narrator is charming. I taught that class for 3 decades, watched hundreds of students learn to spot exactly this kind of thing in a novel. A narrator you shouldn't fully trust, a version of events too convenient to be entirely honest. And I have apparently spent 19 years failing to ask a single one of those questions about my own son. I'm not here to tell you what to think about him," I said. "I only wanted you to hear it from a person, face to face, before a lawyer's letter arrived, and made you feel like a defendant and something you never chose to be part of." She looked at me then, really looked the way you look at someone you're deciding whether to trust with something fragile. "I kept a copy," she said abruptly, standing up from her chair with a suddenness that surprised me. "Everything he's ever had me sign, I keep a copy. Force of habit. 31 years of grading papers taught me that much. Always keep your own record. Never trust that someone else kept theirs accurately. I have a whole file box in the hall closet going back years, further back than you'd probably guess a retired school teacher would bother with. Let me get it. Let me see exactly what he told me I was signing in my own words in the notes I always make in the margins." She was already crossing toward the hallway before I could answer, moving with a brisk, purposeful energy that had replaced almost entirely the composed stillness she'd greeted me with at the door. A woman reaching for evidence, the way another person might reach for a railing on a staircase that had just, without warning, revealed a missing step. I heard a closet door open somewhere down the hall, the scrape of a heavy box being pulled off a shelf, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a woman taking one long, steadying breath before she let herself look at what she'd find inside. I was not in the room for what happened next. I want to be honest about that the same way I've tried to be honest about everything else in this account. What follows I've pieced together since from things Vivian let slip months later in the ugliest stretch of the divorce proceedings, from Desmond's own words given under oath in a deposition I sat through with my hands folded in my lap the whole time, saying nothing, learning everything and from Marlene's careful reconstruction of phone records that filled in the gaps neither of them was willing to fill in themselves. I have told this part the way I understand it happened, as close to the truth as 3 separate imperfect accounts can get a man. I offer it here not because I witnessed it, but because a man cannot fully understand his own undoing without also understanding the smaller undoings that happened alongside it out of his sight, in rooms he never once set foot in.
Eudora called her son that same evening, apparently still sitting in her kitchen with the old file box open on the table in front of her. The 19-year-old document and the new trust paperwork laid side by side like two versions of a story that no longer matched. "Desmond," she said when he picked up, "I need you to explain something to me." He would have used his practiced voice with her, I imagine. The one I'd heard myself at the anniversary dinner. Warm and unhurried. The voice of a man who has never once doubted his welcome anywhere he walks. "What's wrong, Mama?" "A man came to my house today," she told him. "Emmett Sorensen. He showed me paperwork with my name on it, 68% of his company, $40 million, sitting in a trust I apparently agreed to hold. You told me it was retirement paperwork, Desmond. You told me I wouldn't have to do anything at all." I do not know exactly what he said in response. I know from the deposition that he claimed he'd told her the truth of it, that she'd simply forgotten the details in the intervening weeks. That stress does strange things to memory at her age. I remember sitting in that deposition room, watching him say it, watching him reach without apparent shame for the same casual dismissiveness he'd once used to explain away a moved level in my own office. I know Eudora rejected that explanation flatly, both to him that evening and later under oath to a room full of lawyers, because she had, after all, kept her own careful notes in the margins of every document he'd ever handed her, and her notes from that particular signing said nothing whatsoever about controlling interest in a real estate company. Marlene told me afterward that watching a son lie to his own mother's face under oath with a court reporter typing every word was one of the more difficult things she'd witnessed in 20 years of family law. I believe her. I was not able to watch Desmond's face during that particular exchange without thinking of my own father standing in a yard decades earlier, being told by a different confident man that his own memory could not be trusted over a piece of paper. I don't know what Vivian was doing when that call came through. Whether she was in the room with Desmond, whether she overheard any of it directly. What I do know, because she admitted it herself, months later in a moment of anger she likely regretted afterward, is that Desmond called her almost immediately after hanging up with his mother, and that his voice, for the first time in 2 years of careful, controlled infidelity, was not entirely steady. "We need to talk," he apparently told her. Somewhere private. Vivian asked him what was wrong. This part she told me herself, in the kind of unguarded moment that only comes from a person who has already lost the thing they were protecting and no longer sees the point in guarding it. She said Desmond told her it was nothing, just some loose ends on the trust paperwork that needed tightening up, nothing to worry about, and that the particular way he said, "nothing to worry about," was the first time in 2 years she had ever once doubted a single word out of his mouth. I have thought about that moment more than almost any other in this whole affair. The exact instant Vivian's confidence in her own choices first cracked. I was not there to see her face. I only know because she told me so herself, bitterly, in a lawyer's conference room 5 months later, that she went back over every conversation she and Desmond had ever had about the trust structure. Every reassurance he'd given her, that everything was clean, airtight, untouchable, and found for the first time that she could not entirely remember him ever explaining who specifically the trust actually named. I assumed it was some entity he controlled. She told me later, her voice flat with the particular fury of a woman describing her own foolishness out loud. Some LLC with his name buried in it somewhere. I never once asked to see the paperwork myself. I trusted him completely, Emmett, the same way I suppose you trusted me. I did not point out in that conference room how strange it was to hear her use the word trusted about a man she had built an entire betrayal alongside. I have thought about it many times since. Trust, it turns out, is not a finite resource a person spends carefully in one direction. It is closer to a habit formed early and applied indiscriminately, and Vivian had apparently extended the very same unquestioning faith to Desmond that she had for 30 years extended to Meat, right up until the moment it cost her everything. She called him back that same night, according to her own account, and asked him directly, for the first time in 2 years, to simply tell her whose name the trust actually carried. He told her it wasn't important, she said. He told her the structure was designed exactly the way it needed to be designed. that she should trust his legal judgment the way she always had. That bringing it up again would only create problems where none needed to exist. That, she told me, was the moment she finally understood. With a clarity she said she wished she'd never had, that trusting a man's legal judgment and knowing what he'd actually done with it were two entirely different things, and that she herself had been living for months inside the gap between them. I did not feel sorry for her hearing that story later. I want to be honest about that too. But I understood something in it, some small, cold recognition of my own reflection in a version of events I hadn't lived through myself. We had both, in our own ways, mistaken a man's confidence for competence, his composure for honesty, and neither one of us had thought to ask a single sharp question until it was already far too late to matter. I have wondered since whether that is simply the shape betrayal always takes, whichever direction it happens to travel. A confident voice on the other end of a phone call. A reasonable-sounding explanation offered just quickly enough to close the question before it can fully open. A person deciding in the moment that peace is worth more than certainty, right up until the moment peace turns out to have been the most expensive thing they ever purchased. Vivian had spent 30 years watching me trust a handshake the way my father once had, and had apparently judged me for it more than once at dinner parties I was never invited to overhear. It did not occur to either of us, I think, until far too late, that she had been doing precisely the same thing all along, just with better furniture. Vivian told me the rest of it herself months later, in that same lawyer's conference room. Her voice stripped of every ounce of the composure she'd carried into our marriage for 30 years. I have no reason to doubt the shape of what she told me, even accounting for the particular bitterness that colored every word of it by then. Some details a person only remembers with that much precision when they are the exact details that broke something open inside them. Marlene sat beside me that day, taking notes. And I remember her glancing at me once, checking, I think, whether I needed the deposition paused. I did not. I wanted to hear every word of it. She sat alone in the study of the house we'd built together. She said the same study I'd once kept my own desk in before Desmond started using it for his afternoons of quiet, careful theft. It was well past midnight. Desmond's call had ended 20 minutes earlier, his voice still not fully steady. His answers about the trust structure, vaguer than she had ever once heard him allow himself to be. She opened her laptop. She told me she did not fully understand in that moment what she was looking for, only that some old habit of due diligence, some remnant of the careful woman she'd been before she let herself stop asking questions, had finally reasserted itself, uninvited and unwelcome, at nearly 1 in the morning. She typed the name into the search bar the way you'd type any unfamiliar name, expecting nothing in particular, expecting perhaps a professional listing, a LinkedIn profile, some corporate footnote that would explain in one clean sentence why this particular woman's name sat where it sat. Eudora Whitfield. The first results, she told me, were unremarkable. A retirement announcement from the Galveston Independent School District dated several years back. A short mention in a local paper about a Teacher of the Year award from decades earlier. A handful of old yearbook dedications from grateful former students, the kind of digital footprint any beloved schoolteacher accumulates over 3 decades without ever once intending to. Nothing about real estate. Nothing about trusts or holdings or $40 million or any hint of the financial architecture Desmond had apparently built around this woman's name. She tried different searches after that first pass, she told me, growing more methodical the way a frightened person often does. Adding words like trustee and holdings, and even at one point fraud, none of which returned anything that connected this ordinary retired teacher to the 68% Desmond had assured her over and over was airtight and untouchable. The gap between the woman the internet described and the woman whose name apparently anchored $40 million only grew wider with every search, until Vivian said she began to wonder seriously whether she'd simply been handed the wrong name entirely. Whether some clerical error somewhere had attached an innocent stranger to a mess that had nothing to do with her. She said she almost called Desmond back right then, almost demanded he explain the discrepancy immediately, before some quieter, more cautious instinct told her to keep searching first and confront him only once she actually understood what she was confronting him about. She scrolled further, she said, growing more unsettled with each unremarkable result. Rather than less, because a woman capable of anchoring that kind of structure ought to have left some trace of financial sophistication somewhere, and Eudora Whitfield had left nothing but the quiet, ordinary record of a life spent almost entirely in classrooms. It was an old newspaper archive digitized years after the fact that finally gave her what she was looking for. A brief item from a Galveston Daily News Society column decades old, covering a high school graduation ceremony. Buried in a paragraph about outstanding faculty was a single line, the kind of throwaway detail small-town papers used to include as a matter of course. Longtime English teacher Eudora Whitfield, mother of local attorney Desmond Whitfield, was recognized for her 3 decades of service to the district. Vivian read that sentence, she told me, 4 separate times before it fully settled into her. Each passed slower than the last. The way you reread a diagnosis, hoping the doctor's handwriting has somehow changed between readings. She said she sat perfectly still in that study for what felt like a very long time afterward. The cursor blinking on her screen. The house entirely silent around her except for the particular hum of an air conditioner that had needed servicing for weeks, and that Desmond had promised more than once to have someone come look at. Mother of local attorney Desmond Whitfield. She told me she thought first that it had to be a coincidence, some other Eudora Whitfield, entirely. A common enough name in a town this size. And she said she actually laughed once, alone in that study, at the absurdity of the alternative, before the laugh caught somewhere in her throat and turned into something else entirely. She clicked back to the trust filing Desmond had walked her through months earlier, the one he'd assured her was airtight, untouchable, designed exactly the way it needed to be designed, and found printed in the same plain block letters Roz would later show me in her own office, the very same name, the same spelling, the same middle initial. I asked him. She told me whether the trustee was someone he controlled. He told me it was designed to be neutral. He never once said the word mother. In 2 years, in every conversation we ever had about protecting what we'd built, he never once told me his own mother's name was sitting underneath all of it. I did not ask her, sitting across that conference table months later, why the omission had wounded her so. Specifically more than the affair itself. More than the theft itself. More than any of the dozen betrayals that had accumulated between us by then. I think I understood it without asking. There is a particular kind of humiliation in discovering that even the architecture of your own deception was kept from you. That you were not even trusted enough to be told whose name was actually holding the thing you'd helped steal. She closed the laptop, she said, and sat in the dark study for a long time afterward. In the same house I had restored with my own hands 11 years earlier, surrounded by walls that had never once given her a straight answer about anything, though she had certainly never asked them any questions either. She told me she did not cry, not that night. She said the anger came first, sharp and immediate, and only much later, weeks into the unraveling of everything, did something closer to grief finally arrive to replace it. I have thought since she told me all this about how strange it is that the 2 people who most wronged me in this entire affair discovered their own betrayal of each other in almost exactly the same way I discovered mine, alone at night, staring at a piece of paper that finally said the thing nobody had been willing to say to their face. There is a kind of justice in that, I suppose, though it never once felt like justice to me. It only ever felt like watching the same house collapse from a second different angle, the same cracks running through a different set of walls, the same unwillingness in every single person involved to check whether the thing they were standing on was actually plumb before they trusted it with their whole weight. My father used to say, "A house rarely fails all at once. It fails one quiet, unchecked assumption at a time, until one day the whole structure simply announces all at once everything it had been quietly hiding for years." Vivian called Desmond back a second time that same night, according to what she told me later, no longer willing to accept the vague reassurances he'd offered the first time around. She told me she'd sat with her phone in her hand for nearly 20 minutes before she finally dialed, rehearsing the question the way you'd rehearse a difficult conversation with a doctor, wanting to be certain she asked it plainly enough that there would be no room left for him to slip around it. She asked him directly whether Eudora Whitfield was his mother. She told me there was a long pause on the line before he answered, long enough that she already knew the answer before he gave it to her. The particular silence of a man calculating how much of the truth he could still afford to withhold. "Of course she is," he finally said, as though the question itself were somehow beneath him. "She's the trustee, Vivian. It's a family structure. It's the most natural thing in the world." "You told me it was neutral," Vivian said. "You used that word, neutral." "Your own mother is not neutral, Desmond. Your own mother is the single least neutral person you could possibly have chosen, and you knew that the entire time you were using that word with me. I do not know exactly how the rest of that call went. I know because she told me herself that it ended without resolution, both of them angrier than they'd been with each other in 2 years, and that Vivian did not sleep at all that night, turning the whole architecture of her own affair over in her mind, the way I had turned over the architecture of my marriage weeks earlier, looking for the load-bearing lie underneath it. Eudora called me the following morning before 8, her voice steadier than it had been the day I'd left her, sitting with that file box open on her kitchen table. I could hear faintly behind her the particular clatter of a kitchen radio tuned to a morning news program. The ordinary sounds of a woman who had apparently decided that, whatever storm was coming, breakfast would still be made and the radio would still be turned on. Because some routines a person keeps precisely because the rest of the world has stopped making sense. "I've been up most of the night," she told me, reading through everything Desmond ever had me sign, cross-referencing it against my own notes. "And I want you to know, Mr. Sorensen, that I have reached a decision I intend to keep, regardless of what it costs anyone in this whole ugly business, including myself." I told her I was listening. "I am not going to quietly hand this trust back to either one of them," she said. "Not to my son and not to your wife. Whatever I signed, whatever I was told, the fact remains that my name is the one on this paperwork, and I intend to use whatever authority that actually gives me to make sure nobody in this affair gets to simply walk away with something they took by lying to the people closest to them." I asked her what that meant, practically speaking. "It means," she said, "that I have been thinking about your wife's divorce settlement. The one your lawyer mentioned to you was already scheduled. I understand these things typically happen behind closed doors. Lawyers in a room, papers signed, everyone walking out having agreed to something civil and quiet for the sake of appearances. I do not intend to let this one stay quiet, Mr. Sorensen. I taught school for 31 years. I have sat through a great many parent conferences where 2 adults tried very hard to paper over a child's bad behavior with polite language and closed doors. I have never once seen that approach actually fix anything. I called Marlene the moment I hung up with Eudora, and between the 3 of us over the course of that single long morning, we built the shape of what would happen next. The settlement conference already scheduled for the following week in a conference room at Marlene's firm, both parties and their attorneys present to hammer out the final terms of the divorce cornerstone's assets. The whole ugly ledger of 30 years finally reduced to a spreadsheet everyone would sign and walk away from. Eudora would attend. Uninvited, unannounced to anyone but the 3 of us. With her own copies of every document Desmond had ever handed her, including the notes she'd kept faithfully in the margins of each one. Marlene was cautious about it at first, the same caution she brought to everything. "This isn't standard procedure, Emmett," she told me, pacing a little behind her desk the way she did when she was working through the angles of a problem out loud. "Bringing an unexpected third party with independent documentation into a settlement conference is going to blow up whatever careful strategy Vivian's attorney thinks they're walking into. It could also blow up ours, if we're not exact about how we handle it. Judges and opposing counsel do not generally appreciate surprises, however well-founded. I need you to understand that going in." I told her I understood the risk. I told her I wanted it anyway. "I have spent this entire ordeal watching people solve their problems quietly," I said. Vivian solved her guilt quietly at a ballroom podium, dressed up as generosity. Desmond solved his mother's usefulness quietly, one signature at a time, never once telling her the full truth of what she was signing. I am done solving anything quietly. If Eudora Whitfield is willing to stand in that room and tell the truth in front of everyone who lied to her, then I intend to make sure that room is exactly where the truth finally gets told in front of the people who most need to hear it. This is the choice I made, and I want it on the record plainly, the same way I've tried to put everything else on the record in this account. I could have let Marlene handle the settlement quietly. The professional way, papers exchanged positions, negotiated the whole affair, concluded with a minimum of public embarrassment for everyone involved, myself included. I chose instead to let it become exactly as loud and as exposed as the original lie had been. My father spent his whole life keeping his disputes small and private, out of some inherited sense of dignity, and it had cost him everything he owned. I decided, standing in Marlene's office that morning, that I would rather risk a public unraveling than protect anyone's comfort at the expense of what actually happened. Marlene finally nodded the particular nod of a lawyer who has decided a risk is worth taking. "All right," she said. "I'll make sure Eudora is cleared to attend as a material witness with standing, given her name is directly on the disputed trust. It's unconventional, but it's defensible. Vivian's attorney is going to object the moment Eudora walks through that door." "Let them object," I said. "Let the whole room hear exactly what they're objecting to." The settlement conference was confirmed for the following Thursday 10 in the morning, Marlene's own conference room. The same one where I would sit months later, listening to Desmond lie to his mother's face under oath. I did not know that part yet. Standing in Marlene's office that morning, I only knew that for the first time since a ballroom full of candlelight had taught me the true shape of my own marriage, I finally had a plan, a room, and a date, and I intended to walk into all three of them with nothing left to hide. I drove home that afternoon with the windows down, the humid Gulf air moving through the truck the way it always did in late fall. And I thought, for the first time in weeks, not about what I had lost, but about the particular shape of the reckoning I had chosen instead of the quiet one. My father never once got a room like that, a table where the truth could finally be spoken out loud by everyone who owed it to everyone else. I intended to use mine for exactly what he had never been given the chance to use one for. The conference room at Marlene's firm had the particular hush of a room built for expensive silences, long walnut table water glasses nobody drinks from, a view of Broadway through tinted glass that made the whole street outside look slightly cooler and more distant than it actually was. I had sat in that same room once already, weeks earlier, hearing Marlene tell me exactly how little of 40 years remained legally mine. It felt different walking in this time, knowing what was coming. Vivian arrived first, with her own attorney, a sharp, efficient woman named Priscilla Okafor, who I'd met exactly once before at a deposition scheduling call that had lasted 4 minutes and told me everything I needed to know about her competence. Desmond arrived a few minutes later, not as counsel, since he'd wisely recused himself from any official role in the divorce once the conflict of interest became too obvious to hide, but as what Priscilla's paperwork listed, almost comically, as a family financial advisor present at Ms. Sorensen's request. He wore a gray suit I recognized the same one he'd worn to my anniversary dinner, and I remember thinking it was a strange thing to notice a man's tailoring on a morning like that. Vivian looked tired in a way I had rarely seen her look in 30 years. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent several sleepless nights doing arithmetic she never wanted to learn how to do. Her makeup was careful, precise, the way it always was. But there was a stiffness in how she held her shoulders that told me the composure underneath it had cost her something to assemble that morning. She did not look at me when she sat down. I did not expect her to. We opened, as these things do, with the tedious formalities Priscilla and Marlene, trading language about asset schedules and disclosure timelines, the whole ugly ledger of 30 years being reduced, piece by piece, to line items on a spreadsheet. 68% of Cornerstone, the real estate holdings, the operating accounts, all of it, discussed in the flat, careful language lawyers use to keep a room from catching fire. I sat mostly silent through the first 20 minutes, watching Desmond more than I watched anyone else. He kept his composure well better than I expected, offering the occasional clarifying comment about the trust structure in the same warm, unhurried voice I'd first heard at my own anniversary dinner. I noticed, though, a stillness in his hands that hadn't been there before, a man keeping his fingers deliberately flat against the table, rather than letting them do whatever they wanted to do. We were perhaps 30 minutes into the meeting, Priscilla in the middle of outlining a proposed division of the Cornerstone shares that would have left the Harborview Trust entirely undisturbed. 68% quietly folded into whatever final settlement Vivian and Desmond had privately arranged, when the conference room door opened without a knock. Eudora Whitfield walked in, wearing the same straw hat she'd worn in her garden, a canvas tote bag over one shoulder, heavy enough that it pulled her posture slightly to one side, and set it down on the walnut table with a solid, deliberate thud that stopped every conversation in the room at once.
"I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, not sounding sorry at all, in the particular tone of a woman who has spent 31 years walking uninvited into rooms full of people behaving badly. "But I understand there's a meeting happening about my trust, and nobody thought to include the trustee." Desmond went white. I watched it happen in real time, the color draining out of his face in a single visible wave. And I understood, watching him, that whatever careful story he'd been telling himself about how this settlement would go had never once accounted for his own mother walking through that door. "Mama," he said, standing halfway out of his chair. "What are you doing here?" "I'm doing my job," she said calmly, setting her tote bag on its side and beginning to remove folders from it, one at a time, laying them across the walnut table with the same unhurried precision she'd probably once used distributing exams to a room full of nervous seniors. "As trustee of the Harborview Family Trust, I have both a right and, I'd argue, an obligation to be present for any proceeding that determines the disposition of assets held under my name. Your colleague here confirmed as much this morning when I called to ask." She glanced toward Marlene with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Priscilla Okafor found her voice first. "This is highly irregular," she said, looking toward Marlene with open suspicion. "If Mrs. Whitfield has some prior relationship to this matter that wasn't disclosed—" "She has every relationship to this matter," Marlene said evenly. "Her name is the one actually holding 68% of Cornerstone Realty Group. I'd have thought that made her rather central to today's discussion, not incidental to it." Vivian had not said a word since Eudora walked in. I watched her, instead, watched the particular stillness settle over her face as she looked back and forth between Desmond, still half risen from his chair, and Eudora calmly laying out document after document across the table between them. I recognized that stillness. I had worn it myself in a ballroom weeks earlier, in the exact moment a comfortable version of reality had finally given way to an uncomfortable one. Eudora opened the first folder, the original trust formation documents, and beside it a second folder, older, worn at the corners, the notes in the margins written in the same careful schoolteacher's hand Roz had first shown me weeks earlier. "I want everyone in this room to understand something clearly," Eudora said, not raising her voice at all, which somehow made it carry further than shouting would have. "I did not knowingly agree to hold 68% of anyone's company. I was told this was retirement paperwork. I have my own contemporaneous notes proving exactly what I was told on the exact day I signed it, in my own handwriting, which any forensic document examiner in this state will confirm was written the same day as the signature itself, not added after the fact to suit anyone's convenience." "Desmond," she said, turning finally to look directly at her son, "explain to this room what you told me in your own words right now, or I will read my notes into the record myself, and I promise you they will not flatter you." Desmond opened his mouth, once closed it again. Glanced toward Priscilla, as if hoping she might rescue him with an objection, some procedural lifeline that would end this before it fully began. Priscilla, to her credit, said nothing at all. Whatever loyalty she owed her client, it apparently did not extend to defending a man who was not technically her client at all. "Mama, please," Desmond finally said, his voice dropping into something quieter, almost pleading, entirely unlike the smooth confidence I'd watched him wear at every meeting I'd ever sat through with him. "Not here. Not like this, in front of everyone." "There is no better place," Eudora said. "You made sure of that yourself the moment you decided the truth was something you could manage. Quietly. One signature at a time, without ever once telling the person whose name you were using what she was actually agreeing to." The room had gone entirely silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, and somewhere below us on Broadway,
the distant sound of traffic that seemed, in that moment, to belong to some other ordinary world, entirely separate from the one sitting around that table. Vivian turned her head slowly and looked at Desmond, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when you are finally fully understanding the exact shape of what they've done. Not just to a stranger's marriage, not just to a company you'd helped dismantle together, but to the one person in his entire life who had trusted him longest and most completely. I watched her face change. I have thought about that particular change many times since, and I have never quite found the words to fully describe it except to say that it was the same change I had felt happen inside my own chest weeks earlier, standing in a kitchen with a coffee mug and a moved level. The exact moment a person stops defending someone out of love and starts instead simply watching them from a great and sudden distance. 2 years, Vivian said. And her voice, when it finally came, was quieter than I expected. Quieter than the anger building underneath it seemed to warrant. 2 years, Desmond. I gave you 2 years of my life. I helped you build this entire structure. I trusted you with my own husband's company, and you couldn't even trust me with the name of your own mother. She was not looking at me while she said it. I want to note that clearly because I have thought about it many times since the particular strangeness of sitting at that table while my wife of 30 years delivered word for word nearly the exact accusation I had wanted to level at her weeks earlier in our own kitchen over a coffee mug and a moved level. I said nothing. There are moments a man learns to simply let a room finish collapsing on its own. I protected you, Desmond said, turning toward her now. Some of his old composure returning, as he found apparently a version of the story he thought he could still manage. Everything I did to insulate you from liability, Vivian. If this ever came apart, and I always knew there was a chance it might, I wanted the exposure to sit somewhere neither of us could be directly tied to. My mother was the safest, cleanest option. She has no business relationship to either of us, on paper. That was the entire point. The safest option, Eudora repeated, and something in her voice had gone very cold, very still. The particular stillness I imagined she'd once used to silence an entire classroom with a single sentence. You mean I was the most disposable option, a woman with no lawyer of her own, no reason to ask hard questions, no history of doubting a word you've ever told her? That's not fair, Desmond said. You know that's not fair. I would never have let anything actually happen to you in this. I was managing the risk, protecting the family, all of it, the whole structure. It was always going to come back to you and Vivian in the end, once the dust settled. Eudora studied him a long moment, and I watched something pass behind her eyes that I recognized immediately. The exact expression of a teacher realizing mid-sentence that the student in front of her has stopped listening to the actual content of the lesson and started instead calculating how to talk his way out of the consequences. Desmond turned back to Vivian then, and I watched him shift tactics entirely, his voice softening into something almost tender, almost persuasive. Vivian, listen to me. None of this changes anything between us. We can still walk out of here with everything we planned. My mother simply needs a little time to understand the full picture, that's all. If you and I present this calmly, together, as partners, I think she'll see reason. I do not think in that moment Desmond understood the mistake he'd just made. I watched Eudora's face while he said it, watched the particular hardening that came over her at the phrase "we planned together as partners." The confirmation spoken plainly in front of everyone that his mother had never once been a partner in any of it, only a tool. And that even now, cornered, he was still calculating how to manage the people around him, rather than actually reckoning with what he'd done to any of them. I'm going to say this once, clearly, Eudora said. And I want it understood by everyone in this room, including the court reporter. I understand Ms. Kessler has had transcribing since I walked in. I am not returning this trust to either of you. Not to my son, who lied to me for reasons he is still, even now, describing to me as management rather than deception. And not to you, Vivian Sorensen, who benefited from that deception for 2 years, without once asking a single question about whose name was actually protecting your interests. Vivian opened her mouth to protest. Eudora did not let her. I taught for 31 years. Eudora continued, her voice never once rising, which somehow made every word land harder than shouting could have. I have watched a great many children try to talk their way out of consequences, using exactly the tone you are both using with me right now. Calm, reasonable, appealing to whatever loyalty they believe they still have a right to. Blood does not buy loyalty, Desmond. Neither does 30 years of marriage buy it. Ms. Sorensen, once you have already spent that trust on someone else. I raised you to be better than the man sitting in that chair right now. I do not know anymore whether that lesson ever actually took. The room stayed silent a long moment after that. I watched Desmond's face cycle through something close to shame, quickly replaced by a flare of defensive anger, the particular expression of a man who has been told an uncomfortable truth and has decided in real time to resent the person who told it to him, rather than sit with what it actually meant. I want that trust dissolved, Eudora said, turning finally to Marlene. Properly, legally, with the shares returned to independent oversight, until a court can determine their rightful disposition. I will not be a party to whatever either of these two intended to do with what was never honestly mine to hold in the first place. Marlene nodded, already reaching for a legal pad. I can draft the petition this afternoon, she said. It will name you as petitioner seeking to void the trustee designation on grounds of fraudulent inducement. Given your documentation, I don't anticipate the court will need much convincing. Thank you, Eudora said. She began then, closing the folders she'd opened across the table, one at a time, the same unhurried precision with which she'd laid them out. Stacking them neatly, squaring the corners the way I imagined she'd once squared a stack of graded essays before handing them back on a Monday morning. She did not look at Desmond again while she did it. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice a second time. She simply closed her tote bag, settled its strap back over one shoulder, and stood. Mama, Desmond said, his voice cracking slightly on the single syllable, "Please." Eudora paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame, the same way it had rested there, the first morning I'd stood on her porch. She did not turn around fully, only enough that I could see the side of her face, composed, tired, entirely resolute. I taught you to read carefully so you would never be fooled by a bad narrator, she said quietly, almost gently. I never once imagined I would have to apply that lesson to you. She walked out without another word, the door closing behind her with a soft, ordinary click that felt, in that particular silence, louder than anything else that had been said in the entire room that morning. Nobody spoke for a long moment afterward. Desmond sat very still, staring at the door his mother had just walked through, and I watched something in him deflate that had nothing to do with the money at all. Some final, structural piece of himself that had apparently depended all along on believing he could talk his way past any consequence, given enough time and the right, calm, reasonable voice. Vivian did not look at him. She did not look at me either. She stared instead at the neat stack of folders Eudora had left behind on the walnut table, squared corners, untouched, evidence of a woman who had come prepared to leave a clean and orderly record of exactly what had been done to her. I thought sitting there, in that particular silence, of my father in a different yard, decades earlier watching a man in a clean shirt keep his composure, while the truth of what he'd done sat undeniable on the ground between them. Nobody had ever once made that man face a room the way Eudora Whitfield had just made her own son face this one. I found watching Desmond's face that I took no pleasure in it. I only felt very clearly that something long overdue had finally quietly happened. The months that followed did not resolve the way courtroom dramas resolve on television, with a single decisive ruling and a judge's gavel closing the whole matter cleanly. Real fraud litigation, I learned, moves the way water moves through a cracked foundation. Slow, patient, finding every weak seam before it finally, eventually, brings something down. Eudora's petition to void the trustee designation succeeded within 2 months faster than Marlene had expected, largely on the strength of her contemporaneous notes, which the court's own forensic examiner confirmed had indeed been written the same day as each signature. But voiding the trust did not simply hand the 68% back to me clean and whole, the way I had once naively imagined it might. It returned the shares instead to a kind of legal limbo contested three ways at once. Vivian's divorce attorneys arguing for equitable division under the original marriage. My own attorneys arguing for full restoration on grounds of fraudulent inducement, predating any legitimate transfer, and the district attorney's office, once criminal charges entered the picture, arguing that a significant portion ought to sit frozen entirely as potential restitution in a case against Desmond that was by then no longer merely civil. Desmond was disbarred within the year, the Texas State Bar moving with a speed I found almost satisfying, given how slowly everything else in that whole affair seemed to move. He faced criminal charges as well, elder financial exploitation among them, a charge his own mother's testimony did more to secure than anything Marlene or I ever provided. I sat through part of that trial too, though I was not required to, simply because I found I wanted to watch the whole architecture of it finally come down, in a room with consequences attached. I heard secondhand that he left Galveston entirely once the plea agreement was finalized, moved to some other state, some other bar exam, whatever fresh start a disgraced lawyer manages to piece together after a fall like that. I have not spoken to him since the deposition. I do not expect I ever will again. Eudora and I spoke a handful of times in the months after the settlement conference. Brief practical calls mostly related to the ongoing litigation, and once, unexpectedly, an invitation to sit on her porch and drink iced tea, an offer I accepted more out of curiosity than obligation. She told me that afternoon that she had gone back to substitute teaching 2 days a week, mostly to have somewhere to be that had nothing whatsoever to do with trusts or attorneys, or the particular grief of a son, who still, as far as she knew, had not once called to apologize. I did not ask her whether she expected him to. Some questions, I have learned, are kinder left unasked. Vivian and I finalized our own divorce 9 months after that anniversary dinner. The settlement itself almost anticlimactic by the time it finally arrived, most of Cornerstone's actual value having been consumed by then in legal fees, frozen accounts, and the general erosion that happens to any company sitting too long in public dispute. Clients grew nervous, contracts lapsed. The $40 million company I had spent 40 years building was worth, by the time the lawyers finished arguing over who deserved which percentage of it, considerably less than half that, and even that diminished sum remained tangled in litigation I could see clearly would take years more to fully untangle. I remember the exact afternoon I told Marlene I wanted out of the fight entirely. "We were close," she said, sitting across her desk from me, genuine surprise in her voice. "Another year, 18 months at the outside, and I think we recover the majority of what's rightfully yours." "I believe you," I told her. "I have watched you work this whole thing with more precision than I've watched almost anyone work anything in my life. But I am 64 years old now, Marlene, and I have spent the better part of a year fighting to reclaim a version of my life that I have come to understand I do not actually want back. I do not want Cornerstone the way it exists on paper anymore, tangled in liens and frozen accounts and the ghost of everyone who lied to me to get it. I want my hands back. I have missed my hands more than I have missed any of the rest of it." Marlene did not argue with me for long. She drew up the paperwork to release my claim to the remaining disputed shares, accepting instead a modest settlement. The truck, the tools, the cabin on Bolivar, the $60,000, and a small additional sum that would, once all the legal fees were finally paid, leave me with just enough to do exactly what I told her I wanted to do. She did ask me, once signing the final release, whether I thought I'd regret walking away from the larger fight. I told her I thought I would regret far more spending another 18 months of a life I did not have unlimited supply of fighting over the exact size of a wound, rather than simply letting it finally begin to close. I did not tell most people what became of Vivian Desmond, or the wreckage of Cornerstone Realty Group after that. Mostly because I genuinely do not know the full accounting of it myself, and partly because I found once I'd let go of the fight that I no longer particularly wanted to know. I understand the company itself was eventually sold off in pieces, Its remaining value split 3 ways among creditors, the state, and whatever was left for Vivian once her own legal fees were settled. An amount, from what I gathered secondhand, considerably smaller than the fortune she'd once stood up in a ballroom and called protected. Nobody, in the end, walked away with anything close to what they'd once believed they were fighting for. I have thought more than once that there was a kind of justice in that particular shape of loss, though I never once went looking to confirm the details. I reopened the storefront on Ball Street the following spring. The same narrow building where I'd mixed my very first batch of mortar, wrong, twice, under Constance Beaumont's patient supervision. Where I'd laid the last seam of my old life, alone, in the dark, on the worst night of that whole ordeal. I hung a small hand-lettered sign in the window, nothing fancy, Sorensen Restoration. And I hired exactly one employee, a young man named Caleb who'd apprenticed under me years earlier and had never once stopped calling to ask when I might be hiring again. Our first job was a modest one. A craftsman bungalow 2 streets over, whose owners wanted its original brick porch restored, after decades of poor patchwork repairs by contractors who'd never once cared to match the original mortar recipe. I stood on that porch, on a bright, ordinary Tuesday morning, my crew of 1 setting up behind me, the whole quiet weight of everything that had happened, finally settling into something I could actually carry. I took my trowel out of the truck, the same one I'd bought at 19 years old, worn smooth in the exact places my hand had worn it smooth for 45 years now, through every version of the life it had built for me, and every version it had helped me survive losing. Caleb watched me from the sidewalk a moment, not saying anything, the particular patient silence of a young man who has apprenticed under an older one long enough to know when a job is about to become something more than just a job. I mixed the first batch by hand, the ratio, unmeasured muscle memory doing the counting the way it always had. I knelt at the base of that old brick porch, in the ordinary Galveston sunlight, with nobody watching who wanted anything from me but honest work. No ballroom, no lawyer's conference table, no folder of documents laid out like an accusation. Just a porch, a trowel, and 45 years of hands that had never once through any of it forgotten how to do the one thing nobody had ever managed to take from me. I laid the first brick myself. I still keep that trowel on a hook beside the door of the Ball Street shop, exactly where a man can reach it without looking, the way I once kept a level hanging in an office that no longer belongs to anyone I know. Caleb and I took on our 3rd client last month, a widow out on Broadway who wanted her late husband's porch steps restored the way he'd always meant to get around to fixing them himself. I noticed laying that mortar that I no longer flinch at the word protected when I hear it in ordinary conversation. It has taken the better part of a year to get there. I do not know what became of the coffee mug that started the whole unraveling of my kitchen that night, or whether Vivian ever thinks of it the way I still sometimes do. I know Eudora sends me a card every year around the holidays. Brief and warm, the same careful schoolteacher's handwriting I first saw in the margins of her old files. I know my father, if he were still alive to see any of this, would not have said much about it at all. He would have simply walked the length of the wall, checked it for plumb, and nodded once if it held. That, in the end, is the only inheritance I fully trust anymore. Not a company, not a signature, not even a marriage, however many years it manages to hold. A man's own 2 hands, and whatever they are honestly capable of building, is the one thing nobody has ever yet found a piece of paper clever enough to take from him. I think often about the difference between owning a thing and having built it, and I have come to believe they are not the same claim at all, however much the law insists on treating them as interchangeable. Vivian owned on paper 68% of something she never once laid a hand on. Desmond owned briefly the illusion of controlling all of it through a woman who trusted him completely. Neither one of them in the end walked away with anything that could survive being tested. I built something instead slowly, with calluses over 45 years. And though a courtroom nearly convinced me that building it meant nothing without the deed to prove it, I have learned since that the deed was never actually the thing that mattered. If you are listening to this and some version of this has happened to you, some quiet betrayal dressed up as generosity,
some paper trail that told you your whole life belonged to someone else's signature, I want you to know there is a version of rebuilding that does not require winning back every dollar you lost. Sometimes the truest kind of winning is simply picking your tools back up, one honest job at a time, and letting the people who wronged you keep whatever hollow version of victory they fought so hard to hold on to. I would ask you this before you go. Have you ever discovered that the person closest to you had already decided quietly long before you found out that you were the one thing in the arrangement that could be sacrificed? And if so, what did you build afterward with whatever was left in your own two hands? I would be glad to hear it wherever you happen to be reading this.